my screen. Now, is my screen being shared successfully? Let's go present. Present the screen. Hopefully, you can see a big ELIZA logo on the screen.
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm not presenting my presenter notes, which is good. Awesome. Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining. This is a short brown bag. I think it's going to be short. Hopefully it's short, with some useful techniques for presenting complex solutions. So at the end of this talk, I'll be running through a bunch of sort of techniques, and feel free to suggest any that you have come across within your career that you find useful for getting across complex topics, doing this sort of presentation that I'll be describing later on, and just maybe share some war stories or some techniques if we have time at the end. So at the end, I'll be asking those questions. You don't have to answer, but if you have anything to share, feel free to do that. All right, so who am I? I'm James Dunwoody. I'm a machine learning engineer at ELIZA. Machine learning engineer in that I bridge the sort of the gap between a data scientist and sort of a developer deploying data science solutions. This talk is about specifically about short-term technical pieces of work, maybe sort of 2, 3, 4 weeks, couple of months or so. Nothing sort of very large, but trying to present the results of that work back to people. Now, too often, and I'm probably not the only one saying this, but too often we go to these presentations and they're nice and technical and very deep, but they become quite impenetrable, and they have lots of technical details. Things like code, we don't want to sort of shy away from code and screens and stuff, but without context, without assistance, it can become just a real slog for the audience to get through a big, hard technical presentation. And then you can tell when it goes maybe a bit astray when there's questions at the end. The presenter asks for questions and it's just dead silence. You know, everyone's been scared off or a bit stunned by the amount of information or the speed of the information, and they're probably a bit exhausted after sort of trying to take in, you know, a real blast of information. So this little talk is hopefully a way to maybe inspire your audience to be interested in what you've done. And in general, when I've found things have worked well, I guess from my experience, you get sort of comments such as, when will this be ready to use? When can we use this in production? You know, is it ready yet? And it's not ready yet, and it can't be used in production just yet. But it's very useful to have that response, because that means your hard work hasn't been wasted. You know, you've been doing a month's worth of work, and people have actually understood it. Just make sure there's no questions so far. Oopsie, any questions? So just make sure I can get that. Whoops. I think there's no questions, so I'll keep going. All right, so the situation that we're describing here is probably three types of work. One will be like your proof of concept. Now, your proof of concept work, you're generally trying to show what's possible. You're trying to show that this thing that you've been asked to do, you've decided to do, has a way of reducing risks for other projects, and you're here to reassure people that what you're recommending is a good idea. You know, you're taking away risk for this proof of concept. Sort of an extreme version of that, or an extreme version of this sort of work, is a hackathon. It's an extremely compressed, highly stressful piece of work, but very technically creative. But also means it can be quite a tricky thing to explain in a short period of time, you know, when you do that sort of work. And the third one is demos of new technology. Now, the point of some of these sort of pieces of work is to show what's possible, but also to educate people about what's there. So it's showing, teaching, educating, a bit more reassuring as well. And you're often trying things with alpha software, stuff that's really cutting edge, or, you know, sometimes barely working, but, you know, you're trying it out. You're sort of seeing what the new techniques are. In all three cases, though, you sort of want to be able to have a good presentation that gets across this hard work that you've done, and you don't want to sort of swamp the audience. So the first technique, the first approach that I'm sort of advocating here is in the planning planning phase for a talk, for a piece of work like this, you work backwards. So when you start planning, you work backwards from the final presentation. Now that can be pretty hard to do when you're in a hackathon. Like you've got like, a day, half a day, couple of days to get on top of this. Easier for a POC, but you'll be doing a bit more work. So you really want to make use or let the presentation decide what you should edit out and what you should keep. And that's not just what you should keep in the presentation, but what you should do in the entire piece of work. If it's not going to make it into the presentation, maybe you can just explain what would happen rather than actually do it. So in the planning phase, for instance, cull what you don't need. So initially you'll have a MVP, a minimum viable product. And that's like the minimum you think you could get away with and still satisfy your goals. Obviously have stretch goals and decide where you want to go from there, but keep an MVP, and that way you're not going to sort of overreach. The benefit of planning for this is you have some risk mitigation to get rid of, things never go to plan. And when things go wrong, what are you going to do? How are you going to mitigate that risk? What are you going to do in case some system that you're trying to integrate with or some piece of technology that you hope to use just doesn't work? So a bit of planning around disasters is pretty useful up front. The next point, which is a little bit unusual, but I think has helped me a lot, is make up a press release. And make up your attempt at a press release. It's a bit of a salesy sort of thing. It's a bit of a blow your own trumpet sort of thing to explain how nice, how good, how great this thing is. It's a great way for you to focus on your audience, to say what would your audience find interesting, what would they find exciting, to look at this piece of work that you're about to present, and keep an eye on what's actually exciting about the project, especially at the start. Very often we start these projects and we're all very excited and it's all very positive. And then by the end, you're a bit tired of it and things haven't sort of gone entirely well necessarily. And so you might have lost some of that excitement. So before you start, write down why it was a great idea. Try and get that enthusiasm down before you become a little bit jaded if you do by the end. Because remember, when you're doing your presentation, hopefully the audience is just as sort of excited and naive as you at the start, and so it can be hard to sort of reproduce that feeling at the end of the piece of work. And then you want to start your slide deck. I find start your slide deck pretty early, so that you can start planning what you actually want to talk about when you do your final presentation. The next point is engaging marketing in the communication teams that you're working with. So often communication with marketing and teams like that require lead times. So you need to sort of let them know days, weeks in advance, maybe not weeks, but days in advance, so that your piece of work can be added to larger communication email blasts or whatever the marketing team is going to do. But it needs to be made in the appropriate format, and you have to give them warning that it's going to come. So there is work involved to translate your work or translate your presentation into something that's appropriate for sharing. But I find it's very useful because that's a great way to get the message out, and we'll run through some steps later, but it's a great way to get feedback and keep this piece of work living beyond this 1 hour presentation that you might do. Next point is you do the work. So you go through the journey of doing this proof of concept, this demo or whatever you're making. But keep notes, take screenshots, record the journey in a journal, record snapshots and any sort of artifacts that you are likely to forget about by the end, but would make useful content and sort of incremental steps along the way, just to show how things went. And it's often easy to forget. And then by the time you finished, you realized, oh, I really wish I kept a screenshot of when it all went badly because it's going so well now, for instance, or something like that. So try and keep a journal of the things that you did along the way. All right, so once you've done your work, once you're getting closer towards the end, send the material to marketing within the deadline or the lead time that they would prefer. And then you perform your presentation. Now, we've all done presentations. Well, I assume we've all done presentations before, and doing things like live demos or sort of risky technical demos are risky for a reason, and we all pray to the demo gods that it's going to work, but it doesn't always work. And so one of the things I highly recommend, or I've found very useful for myself, is recording the presentation beforehand. It doesn't have to be the same thing. It doesn't have to be you just talking into it. It could just be a more of a sort of a show, and you could maybe have an attached document to it, but have something recorded. So in case it goes horribly badly, you have a video to play instead. It's really good. Now, not just because of technical issues though. If you've made this video and you've got it in an appropriate style, so it's a sort of a nice stylish piece of work, this little video you've made, you're protecting against technical issues, but also you can be given to people who weren't able to make it to the presentation, either through scheduling problems, or if the audience is distributed, so they're outside of your company, they're in a different time zone or whatever, and you're able to share it, someone else is able to share it on your behalf, it can get passed around. So videos, pictures, say 1,000 words, I'm sure video says a lot more. So having a video is very useful. It's pretty easy to do a screen grab with software these days to record a video. So try and make it shareable, and make sure it's an appropriate format, and compress it and all that sort of stuff so it's easy to be emailed around. It's also good, I find this is very good, to keep records of your work. If you've done stuff and you want to add it to your CV, or you want to keep it as a record of what your division in the company has done, keep a record of these videos, because it's remarkable how often you can refer back to them. And I'll explain later why technical stuff goes wrong, but in general, keeping a video is a very good idea. Now, once you've finished your presentation, it doesn't end there. You want to encourage and respond to the follow-up questions that hopefully you do get. And there's some ways to encourage those questions and follow up, but be ready for it, be responsive, and then try and get the most from this advertising that has happened, and see what comes out of it. And we'll talk a bit more about some of those unexpected positive outcomes of doing a presentation. So we'll talk a bit more about that later. The next thing is, I'm talking about focus. Now, obviously, some of the stuff seems pretty obvious, and it's a pretty obvious topic, but it's very easy in the heat of the moment to forget about some of these communication approaches. And for technical content, you're going to have spent quite a lot of time on what you're working on. You know, weeks or a month or so trying to work on this. You really aren't going to be able to get through all of this in a talk. You can't get through months worth of work on a talk. And it's going to be very challenging no matter how short. Sometimes for hackathons, you've only got a few minutes. You don't get an hour, and other places you get a bit longer. So focusing on what you need to get across and leaving other parts out, or expressing that they could be done in a certain way is a great way of showing what you need to show without sort of rushing through and trying to speak as quickly as you can. But it's good, again, to embrace the trials and tribulations that you went through while doing your piece of work. So while focusing on the most important things, you can explain how you might do the rest. So the methods of doing that, obviously you can explain, you can show architectural diagrams about how systems can be integrated and things can be made that weren't included in your actual piece of work. You can obviously mock out other systems. There's some very good tools for mocking network layer responses. There's very good prototyping tools that let you simulate entire other systems, and you can do all sorts of hijacking of other systems to make it look like you are correctly integrating it. Perception is very important when you're doing a presentation, and so showing that it actually looks like it can integrate is very important. And again, provide reassurance that the rest is possible. When people see one piece of work and they work in a different department, showing that their department or their component that they're interested in can be integrated is quite a useful thing to sort of show that it isn't a enterprise-ready or integratable solution. But then, of course, you can explain that you had to focus on one particular problem, and the key problem might have been somewhere over to the side, and the rest of it is not really the novel problem you're trying to solve. Now, as with any presentation, there's different audiences, and we'll get to the audience makeup in a moment. But try not to leave anyone behind, and just be aware that people are coming to your presentation with different experiences, backgrounds, and and thought processes. And so it's better to reduce the amount of content and leave people wanting more than to leave everyone behind, or leave a vast majority of the people behind as you rush through the solution. And just remember that the working demo, the working part that you're actually trying to show, doesn't have to be a fully fledged thing. It can be a taster. It can be a taste of the full solution. And if you leave people wanting more, they'll come and ask for, how can we do more for this? So if you can make a nice, sharp working demo that shows a good point, that is better than doing like a lukewarm, broad solution that really doesn't do anything novel or doesn't really go deep enough into any area. Okay, so during the presentation, so you're having a presentation, and you're presenting the work. We mentioned before about considering the audience. So you want to bring everyone up to speed. Everyone wants to sort of understand at least a reasonable portion of your talk. Some people will obviously understand a bit more, but you want everyone who's come to sort of understand. So to get everyone up to speed, best to start slowly and really set the scene. Now it's hard in a hackathon when you're really short on time, but you want to get people ready to listen. You want to get people ready to listen listen to your voice and your way of speaking. If you're rambling like myself, you sort of need to get people used to your style, and then go into the content once you've sort of set the scene a bit. I think we all understand that having a lot of acronyms and in industry jargon or in team jargon is probably not a good idea for a broader audience. So see if you can use fewer acronyms or explain the acronyms, maybe educate a bit about some of the jargon if you have time. Because not everyone works in the same sector as you, unless you're presenting to purely your colleagues. Another thing that I find very, very useful is to explain why you chose to do something. Sometimes it can seem like everything's sort of straightforward, but you're making a whole bunch of decisions, and it's useful to explain why you made the many decisions that you made. And if someone disagrees with your approach, at least they'll understand why you chose approach. And if their suggestions say you choose a different approach, then you can sort of agree to try a different approach next time, rather than sort of saying, well, you were wrong. Well, I chose to do it this way because this was a technical decision I made, or some other reason. So explaining why along the way is very useful. So in terms of the audience, one of the sort of more obvious members are the business members of the audience, stakeholders. Now, this group of people, depending on how your company's set up and how you're presenting, these people are often in back-to-back meetings. They're really having to switch context quite a bit. So this is the group that you have to give the most time to reset and to get used to potentially a technical presentation after they've had a non-technical presentation or discussion for a few hours before that. Business people are very aware of the value, or very interested in the value to the business. So if you can consider the value that the business gains from your solution, really think about it from their perspective and say, what value would the business gain from what I'm attempting to do? And even use terminology as, there is a value. The value to the business can be that there's cost savings, or there's new business opportunities that can arise from this piece of work. And once you have identified business opportunities or that, you can talk about some of the competitive advantages that your solution might have, and you may not be aware of the entire competitive landscape, but at least if you can say, this is, at least from your perspective, unique and ahead of the crowd in a certain way, then that can at least spark some interest, and that's a sort of terminology and techniques that may inspire a business stakeholder to sort of perk up their ears and get really interested in what you're talking about. The next group in your audience, I'm calling the interested parties. I probably don't have a particularly good name for that. Like, for instance, this brown bag, we have in this brown bag discussion that we're having now, there's some people from the Mantle Group and some people from outside of this group. So this is a very fertile, very interesting group to consider for your presentation. Now, they're from other departments, other companies, and you want to sort of show that this cool thing that we're doing is possible. You want to sort of show this is the future. This is what we can do in this department, in this company, in this area. But if you can describe it in a fairly general way, that may let their minds their minds get going, and their ideas start flowing, and they may think of new engagements in some tangents that you haven't really thought of. So cross-department, cross-company opportunities may arise because members of this group have seen what you've done, seen maybe the specific thing that you've described, but the general benefit that it might have. And then we're able to extrapolate and say, well, my department has this problem. My company, we have this problem. It's maybe not the same problem, but it's a similar sort of thing. Maybe we'll have a chat to these people later and or this person later and just see if we can work together and use this proof of concept, this demo, this hack in their business. So it's a very fertile area for adoption of this new idea. The last two groups are colleagues. Now, colleagues are important because you've gained experiences that they potentially would like to leverage, make use of. They'll certainly, from my experience, really want to access the code and whatever methods that you've been producing. So things like code repositories and stuff are good to share with colleagues. In addition to that, they potentially may want to or need to help out with further enhancements or productionization of this work. So they are certainly interested, very invested parties in the success of this work. So reassure them in such a way that you sort of didn't do a bad job and that your choices were reasonable by explaining why. So that's the colleague group. And then the final group will be experts. These sort of not necessarily in your department, but they are experts in the area. And I find it's useful to explain the lessons learnt, the lessons that you've learned along the way, any war stories, any sort of any problems you've discovered. And if you attempt to show comparisons and say that your solution succeeded in a certain way and failed in another, that can help their understanding of where you're at and which part of the ecosystem you are focusing on. And they may offer suggestions because you'll get really good, I get really good recommendations from the experts, and really try and take on their recommendations either through further discussions or further pieces of work, because that they are probably inspired, and it can be quite hard to get experts to consider your own work. They're often quite busy. But when they come to presentations and see something, you may get some very useful guidance because they've taken interest in what you're doing. And then, of course, reassure them again that there's actually some work involved. You've actually done some work. There's actually something here, so that they can actually discover that it's not just all smoke and mirrors. All right, a few more slides to go. So next part is, it's probably pretty obvious, but we show rather than tell. And obviously this presentation, this brown bag I'm doing now is doing a whole bunch of telling. And while I was doing it, I'd love to be able to be showing a bit more, but currently I'm doing a project right now that I'm going to apply all of these techniques to it. So hopefully that's a more representative sample of this expression, but showing what you show your solution, showing what you're attempting to do is, I find much more useful than sort of telling someone that this is the best thing to do. Show it succeeding, show improvements. If you've managed to improve on the status quo, improve on something, even improve throughout the proof of concept, where you started with option A and you finished with option D, and there's improvements between A and D. Show any quantitative improvements that you've made along the way. Very good to do comparisons, compare that this is a certain measurable amount better than another. It's also good to show all your attempts, all the failures, so embrace the failures, show all the things that really didn't go so well. That can show that it's sort of reassure people that it's you didn't just jump to just one solution and suddenly found the perfect one, because I doubt that would ever happen. So yeah, show your failures, show the failures in there, and compare it against the best solution that you tried. I find it's good to show rather than tell, because the audience needs to come up with their own conclusion as to whether what you're trying to present is actually a good idea or not. Now, if you're showing quantitative improvements, saying that this is actually better than something else, or there's improvements in these factors, let them decide whether it's appropriate to be integrated into the business or it's appropriate to be taken further. If you show that there are measurable financial cost improvements or technological improvements, your audience will be sort of hopefully clamoring to get what you've created into production. So maybe a bit less salesy, more collaborative information education sharing, I find can work well to get the proof of concept, the demo a bit further into production. If that makes sense. So get more allies on your side by having them agree with the benefits, and then they can decide if they'll give the tick to go ahead and productionize. Now, complexity, I think I've spent a little bit of time describing that already. So we've got, again, we're talking about complex topics. Better to let people, leave people wanting more than to, again, rush through the entire presentation. Slides and presentations really aren't the best way to get across complex topics. And I'll talk later about some other ways that I like to use, but they are certainly good enough to get things started at least. So again, you want to inspire people, and a success metric for a good talk or a good presentation is people coming back to you afterwards, asking questions, getting a little bit of feedback, hopefully not overwhelming them with technical details. Last couple of slides. Now, this one's, I find, quite important, especially for the stakeholders, but any perception is important. Try and make your presentation as palatable as possible. Your product or your demo, whatever you're making, as palatable as possible. So branding the presentation, as well as all the artifacts with the current branding, the current fonts, the current logos, the current bylines, or whatever's used in your company or in the company that you're trying to represent, so that it feels as acceptable and production ready as you can make it. Make sure you choose all the current logos and the current colors, because they do change. So make sure you know how to date there, and try and find the highest res versions as possible, because you don't want to misrepresent things as a low quality version. You want to make your demo appear as fleshed out and production ready as possible. That way you'll get people asking, well, when can this be put into production? And you can say, we can start a project for that. As well as giving it a memorable name, which is a bit silly at times, but it's the only way I find people will actually come back and talk to you about it if you have a name. If you don't have a name, then they just talk about, oh, you remember that presentation you did a week ago about the thing? And it's like, oh, okay. Whereas if you had a name for it, little cheeky little name or something, that can really help give people something to refer to it. So give it a memorable name, and try and refer to that name in all the material that you send out and that you use later on. We have our final slide. So after the presentation, it's really important that you that the presentation is not the end or the be all and end all of some of this work. You want to have people being able to take this away and share it further. We all know how social media is great for sharing things. Well, sort of word of mouth, corporate social media sharing is pretty successful, I find. So you want to make sure it's really easy for people to have takeaways for your work, your proof of concept, your hack, or whatever. So obvious things like you want your easy contact details. So you want to have your contact details, send them out with it so people can actually refer when they see the video you send to them. We'll have your contact details along with it. Make a web page of the project details. So have a dedicated page with all the branding and all that sort of nice contact details. And what I've found in the past is if you make a catalog of all the products you've worked on, people can come and see, oh, here's the 10 projects, the 10 hacks, the 10 proof of concepts that have been worked on here. These all look great. Maybe we can, shop around and see what else we could take to production. So having a little catalog, I find, has been very useful. A blog is a great way to explain a lot more detail. Great way to have your technical details and a lot more meat on the bone, because people can tolerate a lot more content. So have an associated blog, and I think this talk that I'm doing now, I will definitely be converting into a blog post with as much of this information as possible. So yeah, blogs are great. Maybe have the blog ready before you finish the presentation, unlike me, but if you could do that, I think would be a good idea. As well as that, do other presentations, other brown bags. So if you're doing a hack, for instance, you could actually use that same hack and talk about it in a longer presentation to sort of flesh out some details, have more of a discussion. And what's really important is to take questions, because if you take questions from people, you'll sort of get their interest, and they will hopefully suggest further work. Almost done. So we have a downloadable version of the running system. So if it's possible, if it's at all possible that you have something that you've hacked together, if you could make a version that could run on a phone, it can be bundled up into some form of executable that can run on someone's machine. That can be very useful to give someone a chance of actually trying it out. A bit hard these days, but not if you run on a phone. If you run 100% on a phone, you could possibly do it. Obvious things like code repositories, Docker containers, backing up your environments. Having your code available for someone else to take on is great. Don't just let it die and have it be shut down on some cloud server and then it disappears. As well as consider open sourcing anything that you work on, so that other people outside your organization might be inspired to work on it. Final few points. Demo environments, as you might be aware, they die very quickly. They are either shut down because of costs. They refer to alpha code or alpha dependencies that often they change a lot, or they go away. So it's very very likely that your demo that you made last month just won't run ever again. But if you made a video of it, if you have a video that actually records how the demo works, explaining sort of how it all runs, probably good to do some form of annotation, voiceover or something, so that it can be shared with someone without you being there to explain what's happening. I find that that's worked very well. Obviously, compress the video so it's easy to be shared, publish it on your website with the blog, and try and brand the video as much as possible, so that it actually looks as professional and is as self-contained and shareable on its own as possible. And that's sort of the takeaways that I would recommend that you leave people with, because people may not need that presentation you're doing now. Very rarely aligns with someone's project backlog, their project plans, but they might need it a bit later on. And if you have all the information ready to go for them to use in 3 months, 6 months, or whatever, you're likely to be able to help this proof of concept go into production. Also, people need time to process this new information and allow it to be shared in that sort of corporate social media scenario. They're going to talk to colleagues, share it around, and yes, you don't know who will actually come back to you and say, hey, you remember that project that you named in a memorable way? We'd love to be able to take it further. We've got an idea that we'd love to productionize it. And so that's sort of the takeaways. I've probably blasted through this a little bit quickly. Again, some of these points I'm raising are things I try to work on myself and don't always achieve. But I find that when many of these things come together, I get a good response from the talk. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. We'll go back to, I guess I'm showing my face already. And if there's any suggestions from anyone while I was sort of talking along there, if there's any suggestions that people have for what's worked for them. Let me just see if I can just stop this slide, and I'll go back to myself. So feel free, if I don't know how many people we have online, if we want to unmute, feel free to unmute if you want, or write questions into the chat. But otherwise, thank you very much for listening to my brown bag. Hopefully the mic was on and I didn't say anything. Oh, we got some chat questions in here. Okay, so we go through. Oh yes, so Alexander asked about the mocking systems. Yeah, so what to use for mocking? So for phones, for instance, Apple uses the video presentation software. What I'll do, I'll make my blog post up and I'll put some of the suggestions that I have in the past. But in general, there's very good mocking tools that web designers or web developers often use. So we use, I've used various mocking tools that let me sort of make up very nice looking animations, very nice looking transitions even though the backing systems don't even exist. I might just grab a screenshot of, say if I'm integrating with some back-end large enterprise system, I can grab a screenshot of the page, bring it in, and then overlay various elements and effectively fake out a input terminal or an input form, as well as faking out success screens and all that sort of stuff, just written on top of just an image. So you can go all the way from pure image-based stuff to like Keynote. Keynote's quite nice. Apple's Keynote software is quite nice for being able to fake transitions, and all the prototyping software, the popular ones, I guess depends whatever you're comfortable with. With Docker Container Demo. So with the Docker Container Demo, do you prepare separate containers for Windows, Mac, Linux? Generally, I don't have time for that. It's sort of whatever the container, sort of whatever would work the best when I'm doing the demo is the container that I would keep. Whether I have to spin up that container in the cloud again, that's probably what I would do. I probably wouldn't be running it on a local machine. If it's a sort of a machine learning example, I'd probably pop it up in the cloud. So it's whatever the container is supported up in the cloud, and whatever cloud provider sort of we feel like using at the time. Yeah, it's pretty hard to support every possible permutation of OS and every possible cloud provider, but in general, you can get most containers running most places, I found anyway. All right. No worries. Thank you. Oh, another one. All right. A question. If the presentation was about the first stage of a project that is expected to go into production and the product doesn't seem fit for production, how could you approach it? So if the product doesn't seem fit for production in its current state, I guess if I understand, if the presentation was about the first stage of a project that is expected to go into production, well, yes, it's sort of more about these early proof of concept, technical demo, hackathons. Often, what I often have to do when I make these things is they're a bit scrappy. They're a little bit short. They're pretty seat of your pants, sort of get it all sort of running together. Often it's the idea, the concept, the fact that things can work together that you take into production. Generally, none of the code and some of the libraries won't be used as well, but the general concept of whatever I'm attempting to do is what gets taken into production. Often production teams require, well, almost always production teams require a certain rigor in both the code they use, how it's written, the libraries they choose, all that sort of stuff. And unless you work in that team, you probably don't know exactly what's going to go into production. So I generally just choose the quickest and most sort of innovative way of solving something, and then that is sort of that is the inspiration to take it further into production. So what is generally created in the POC or the demo is generally not closely technically related to what goes into production, but the approach, the technique, is the thing that gets taken into production. So the idea, and then that proof of concept can be used as sort of the almost the requirements, the usability requirements for this particular solution. That's a good question as well. Okay, so that's all. Thank you very much. I've spoken quite a bit, and I guess we'll have another presentation. So I think we'll be sending out another LinkedIn or another email message with the next brown bag, whoever gets sort of the lucky position to do the next brown bag. So thank you very much, everyone. Kate, is there anything you want to say? Or I think I'm pretty good. So
no, all good. Thanks heaps, JD. And yeah, invites for the next one will be out soon.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone. I hope you enjoy it, and enjoy a little bit of sun if you can. Bye-bye.